Oprah confronts manager assaulting pregnant woman. What follows is epic. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a heavily pregnant woman, her hands clutching a small shopping basket, stood at the customer service counter. Her brows were furrowed as she spoke quietly to the manager on duty. A short, stocky man with a sour expression etched deep into his face. Behind her, the store was alive with the mundane sounds of a busy retail chain. Shopping carts rattling, children whining, and cash registers dinging. Yet, the tension radiating from this small exchange at the counter seemed to cut through the normalcy like a knife. "I just wanted to exchange this," the woman said, her voice soft but firm as she held up a small, unopened box. "It's defective, and I still have the receipt." The manager barely glanced at the box before waving a dismissive hand. "No refunds or exchanges on opened items," he barked, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. His tone carried an edge of irritation, and the corners of his mouth curled into a sneer. "Policy's policy, not my problem." The woman blinked, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the receipt on the counter. "But it's not opened," she said, her voice quivering but polite. "It's sealed, and I followed all the rules. It even says on the receipt that I can return it within 30 days. The manager snatched the receipt and glanced at it with exaggerated disinterest before tossing it back on the counter. "Doesn't matter," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're probably trying to scam the store. I've seen your type before." The woman's eyes widened, her face flushing with embarrassment and frustration. "My type," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She instinctively placed a protective hand over her pregnant belly, as though shielding herself from the man's venomous words. Nearby, a few customers had stopped to watch the unfolding scene, their curious eyes darting between the woman and the manager. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, but no one stepped forward to intervene. The manager seemed to thrive under their attention, his voice growing louder and more antagonistic. "Yeah, your type," he said, leaning over the counter with a smug grin. "Always looking for a handout, always trying to game the system. It's people like you who ruin things for everyone else." The woman's lips trembled as she took a step back, her basket slipping from her fingers and landing on the floor with a dull thud. "I'm not trying to game the system," she said, her voice cracking. "I just want what's fair." "Fair?" The manager spat, his tone laced with mockery. "Life's not fair, sweetheart. Now, if you're not buying anything, I suggest you leave before I call security." At that moment, a figure who had been browsing a nearby aisle turned their attention to the commotion. The figure, a middle-aged woman with an air of quiet authority, slowly made her way toward the growing crowd. She wore a cardigan over a fitted blouse, her sharp eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. While most onlookers were content to remain passive spectators, she seemed intent on getting a closer look. The pregnant woman's voice wavered as she tried to hold her ground. "I don't understand why you're treating me this way," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I haven't done anything wrong." The manager crossed his arms over his chest, his smug grin never wavering. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said. "Now get out before I have you escorted out." The bystanders exchanged uneasy glances, some murmuring to each other about the manager's behavior. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but no one moved to intervene. The pregnant woman, now visibly shaken, hesitated, as though debating whether to fight back or retreat. The middle-aged woman who had been watching stepped closer, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She didn't speak right away, instead observing the manager's behavior with an intensity that seemed to unnerve even him. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. The manager turned to her, his sneer faltering for just a moment before he regained his composure. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am," he said, waving her off dismissively. "Just a customer who doesn't know how to follow store policy." The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression cool and measured. "From what I can see, it looks like the customer is following policy. She has the receipt and the unopened product. So, why are you refusing her request?" The manager's face reddened, his bravado cracking under her unwavering gaze. Like I said, he stammered, store policy. Store policy doesn't give you the right to belittle someone. The woman interrupted, her voice sharp enough to make the crowd flinch, especially someone who's clearly in a vulnerable position. The manager bristled, his embarrassment quickly turning to anger. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You can't just come in here and tell me how to do my job." "I don't need to tell you how to do your job," the woman said evenly. "But I will tell you this. Treating people with dignity and respect isn't optional. It's basic human decency." The crowd, emboldened by her words, began murmuring their agreement. A man near the back of the group called out, "Yeah, she's right. Let her return the product." Another chimed in, "This is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong." The manager's eyes darted around the crowd, his confidence faltering as the tide of public opinion began to turn against him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice rising in an attempt to regain control. "Mind your own business," he snapped at the woman. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is my store, and I don't need a lecture from some random busybody." The woman stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "This isn't about your store," she said. "It's about how you treat people. And right now, you're failing." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their disapproval echoing in his ears. The pregnant woman, still clutching her belly, looked up at the woman who had spoken out, her eyes filled with gratitude and hope. And yet, despite the growing tension, the manager stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. The air crackled with unspoken conflict, the confrontation far from over. The manager's face twisted with irritation as he looked at the outspoken woman who had dared to challenge him. He could feel the stares of the crowd boring into him, their murmurs growing louder by the second. The pregnant woman, now standing silently to the side, wiped a tear from her cheek, her trembling hand still clutching her belly. The growing attention didn't soften the manager. Instead, it seemed to fuel his indignation. "I don't know who you think you are," he snapped at the outspoken woman, leaning over the counter in a show of authority. "But you're not helping here. This is my store. My rules." "Actually," the woman replied calmly, her voice cutting through his bluster, "it's not your store. You're just the manager. And if your idea of leadership is bullying a pregnant woman, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." The crowd murmured louder now, emboldened by her sharp words. The manager's face flushed red, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Lady, you have no idea what you're talking about," he barked, pointing a finger at her. "Do you know how many people come in here trying to pull scams? If I gave a refund to every sob story, this place would go under." "She's not pulling a scam," a voice from the crowd called out, and the murmurs of agreement followed. A tall man wearing a baseball cap stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. "She's got a receipt. The box is unopened. What more do you need?" The manager shot the man a withering glare. "This is none of your business," he barked. "If you don't like how I run things, you can shop somewhere else." "Maybe I will," the man shot back. "But not before I make sure everyone knows how you treat people." The manager's jaw tightened, and he slammed his hand on the counter, making several people flinch. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice echoing through the store. "If you don't like how I do my job, you're free to leave. All of you." But the crowd didn't move. If anything, more people were gathering, drawn by the commotion. The tension in the air was palpable, and the manager's frustration was quickly morphing into desperation. The outspoken woman stepped closer to the counter, her expression cool and composed. "Why are you making this so difficult?" she asked. "This could have been resolved 5 minutes ago. Instead, you've turned it into a spectacle." "I'm not the one making it difficult," the manager shot back. "She's the one who started this by trying to get something for nothing." "That's not true," the pregnant woman said softly, her voice shaking but resolute. She looked up at the manager, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just wanted to return a defective item. I didn't ask for any of this." "Save the tears," the manager sneered. Crying doesn't change the rules. The woman behind the counter narrowed her eyes, her calm demeanor giving way to a flash of anger. "You're the one hiding behind rules to justify your behavior," she said. "But rules don't excuse cruelty. You're not enforcing policy, you're being a bully." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement, their disapproval growing louder with each passing moment. The manager's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "Do you have any idea how many liars and cheats I have to deal with every day? Do you have any idea how many people try to take advantage of this store?" "This isn't about them," the woman said firmly. "This is about her." She gestured to the pregnant woman, who was now visibly shaking. "And she hasn't done anything to deserve the way you're treating her." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He glanced around at the crowd, now fully against him, their eyes filled with judgment and disdain. His bravado faltered for a moment, but his stubbornness quickly took over. "You people don't get it," he said, his voice rising. "I'm just doing my job. If you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine. Your job is to serve customers, not berate them," the outspoken woman said. "If you can't do that with basic decency, maybe you shouldn't be in this job at all." A ripple of applause broke out from the crowd, and the manager's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He turned to the pregnant woman, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "Fine," he snapped. "You want your refund? Take it. But don't think for a second that I'm going to forget this. People like you are the reason retail is a nightmare." "People like her?" the outspoken woman repeated, her voice rising. "You mean hardworking, honest people who just want to be treated with respect? If that's your idea of a nightmare, you're in the wrong business." The crowd erupted again, this time with cheers and applause. The manager looked around, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but he stopped himself, his fists shaking at his sides. "You think you're so smart," he muttered under his breath, his gaze darting to the outspoken woman. "But you don't know what it's like to deal with people like her every day. You don't know what it's like to deal with the constant lies, the constant—" "Stop," the outspoken woman said, her voice cutting through his rant. "Just stop. You're not making yourself look any better. You're just proving how little respect you have for the people you're supposed to be serving." The manager fell silent, his face contorted with anger and frustration. The crowd watched him intently, their judgment clear in their eyes. The pregnant woman, still clutching her belly, took a step back, her gaze flickering between the manager and the outspoken woman. The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. The conflict was far from over, but the balance of power was shifting, and the manager seemed to realize it. The crowd had grown noticeably larger now, a mix of shoppers, employees, and curious onlookers who had been drawn to the escalating argument like moths to a flame. The pregnant woman stood silently, her hands gripping the counter for support as she tried to steady her breathing. Meanwhile, the outspoken woman squared off with the manager, her sharp eyes locked onto his, refusing to back down. "You've got a store full of people watching you humiliate yourself," the woman said, her voice cutting and direct. "If you had an ounce of sense, you'd apologize, issue the refund, and move on. But instead, you're digging yourself deeper into a hole." The manager's face twitched, his anger threatening to boil over. "I don't need advice from you," he snapped. "And I sure as hell don't need to explain myself to a bunch of busybodies who don't know the first thing about running a business." "Running a business?" a man from the crowd called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks more like running customers out the door to me." The crowd erupted into scattered laughter, and the manager's fists clenched at his sides. "If you don't like how I do things, there's the door," he barked, pointing toward the exit. "Go ahead, take your opinions somewhere else." "Maybe we will," another voice called out, this one belonging to a woman near the back. "And we'll be sure to leave reviews about how this place treats people." The manager's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he glared at the growing crowd. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You think I care about your Yelp reviews? Go ahead, write whatever you want. It doesn't change the fact that I'm the one in charge here." In charge of what? The outspoken woman shot back. Alienating your customers? Making a pregnant woman cry? If that's your idea of leadership, it's no wonder your store's in chaos. The manager took a step closer to the counter, leaning forward with an intimidating sneer. You don't know anything about me, he growled. You don't know how hard I work to keep this place running. I've dealt with more liars, cheats, and scammers than you can imagine. So excuse me if I'm not jumping to cater to every sob story that walks through the door. This isn't a sob story, the woman replied, her voice steady and firm. It's a legitimate customer with a legitimate issue. And you're choosing to treat her like dirt instead of doing your job. The crowd murmured their agreement, their disapproval growing louder by the second. The manager's eyes darted around the room, his frustration mounting as he realized he was losing control of the situation. Fine, he spat, turning back to the pregnant woman. You want your refund? Here. He grabbed a small wad of cash from the register and slapped it onto the counter. Take it and get out. But don't come back, because we don't need customers like you. The woman flinched at his words, her eyes filling with tears as she hesitated to take the money. I never wanted any trouble, she said softly, her voice trembling. I just wanted to be treated fairly, and I just wanted to get through my day without dealing with another entitled customer. The manager shot back. Looks like neither of us got what we wanted. The crowd gasped at his callousness, their murmurs turning into outright whispers of disbelief. The outspoken woman stepped forward again, her voice rising to match the tension in the room. Enough, she said, her tone commanding. We've all seen enough to know exactly what kind of person you are. And if you think this ends here, you're mistaken. Oh, is that a threat? The manager sneered, his tone mocking. What are you going to do? Call corporate? Write a strongly worded email? Go ahead. See how far that gets you. Farther than you think, the woman said, her voice steady. Because unlike you, I don't need to shout to make my point. Your actions speak for themselves. And everyone here has seen exactly who you are. The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder as more people pulled out their phones to record the interaction. The manager's eyes flicked nervously to the cameras, his bravado faltering for just a moment before he straightened up again. You can record all you want, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. It doesn't change the fact that I'm the one in charge. I make the rules and I enforce them. Rules that you're bending to suit your ego, the woman shot back. You're not enforcing policy. You're bullying someone because you think you can get away with it. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his lips as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, the cracks in his authority growing wider with every passing moment. And yet, his pride wouldn't let him back down. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. All of this over a stupid refund. You people need to get a life. All of this, the woman said, her voice cutting through the noise, is about how you treat people. And if you can't understand that, you have no business being in a position of power. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices rising in unison as they rallied behind the woman's words. The manager's face turned bright red, his frustration boiling over as he slammed his hand on the counter once more. Fine, he shouted. You want to make this a spectacle? Let's make it a spectacle. Security. The pregnant woman flinched, her hands instinctively covering her belly as the manager's voice echoed through the store. The crowd fell silent for a moment, their attention shifting as they waited to see what would happen next. The manager's barked order for security hung in the air, sharp and jarring against the backdrop of the murmuring crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances as the tension escalated further. A lanky young man in a security uniform appeared from one of the nearby aisles, his expression a mix of confusion and hesitation as he approached the counter. What's going on here? The security guard asked, his voice cautious as he looked between the manager and the crowd. What's going on? The manager snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at the pregnant woman. Is that this so-called customer is causing a scene and refusing to leave. Remove her from the store. Now! The security guard blinked, clearly taken aback. His gaze shifted to the pregnant woman, who looked pale and frightened as she clutched her belly protectively. Then he glanced at the crowd, many of whom were recording the interaction on their phones. The weight of their stares made him hesitate. "She's not causing a scene," one woman in the crowd said loudly, stepping forward with her phone raised. "You are, and we're all witnesses." "Yeah," another voice called out. "She's just trying to get a refund." "You're the one yelling and acting out." The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the manager, who was now glaring at him with a look that could curdle milk. "Do your job," the manager barked. "Get her out of here before I have to call the cops." The security guard raised his hands defensively. "Look, I don't think this is—" "Do it," the manager shouted, cutting him off. His voice was shrill now, his composure cracking under the pressure of the crowd's disapproval. "I'm not paying you to think. Get her out." The pregnant woman's breath hitched as the security guard reluctantly stepped closer to her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret, "maybe it's best if you just—" "No," the outspoken woman interrupted, stepping between the guard and the pregnant woman. Her voice was calm but firm, and her presence radiated authority. "She's not going anywhere. She has every right to be here, and she hasn't done anything wrong." "Excuse me," the manager snapped, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "Who do you think you are, telling my security what to do?" "I'm someone who knows a blatant abuse of power when she sees it," the woman shot back. "And right now, you're embarrassing yourself and this store in front of half the town." The crowd murmured their agreement, their voices growing louder as more people joined in. A man near the back of the group shouted, "This is harassment. She's done nothing wrong." Another chimed in, "Where's the corporate number? I'm reporting this." The manager's hands shook with barely contained rage. "I don't care what you people think," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This is my store, and I make the rules." "No, you don't," the outspoken woman said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You enforce the rules, and right now you're twisting them to justify your own behavior. That's not leadership, that's bullying." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their collective energy overwhelming the manager, who looked like he might combust on the spot. His eyes darted to the pregnant woman, then to the security guard, and finally to the outspoken woman, who stood her ground like an immovable force. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You want to play hero? Be my guest. But don't think for a second that you're going to win." "I'm not playing," the woman replied. "And this isn't about winning. It's about doing what's right." The manager sneered, his gaze narrowing as he leaned over the counter. "What's right," he said, his voice low and menacing, "is that people like her don't get to walk all over people like me. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let some entitled customer and her bleeding heart defender ruin everything." "Sacrificed," the outspoken woman repeated, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. "You think this is about your sacrifices? You're standing here, abusing your power, and you have the audacity to paint yourself as the victim." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Several people stepped closer, their phones raised high as they recorded every moment. The manager's face twisted with fury, his hands gripping the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Security!" he shouted again, his voice cracking under the strain. "Get her out of here. Get all of them out. I don't care anymore." The security guard hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to the manager and the overwhelming disapproval of the crowd. "Sir," he said carefully, "maybe we should just—" "Do it!" the manager screamed, slamming his fist on the counter. "Or you're fired." The guard flinched at the outburst, his face pale as he looked to the outspoken woman for some kind of guidance. She held his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't have to be a part of this." The pregnant woman let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion as she leaned against the counter for support. "Enough," a voice from the crowd called out, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This has gone too far." The manager turned sharply toward the voice, his eyes blazing with rage. "And who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the store. The voice didn't answer immediately, but the crowd parted slightly, their murmurs growing quieter as they turned to see who had spoken. The tension in the air was suffocating, the conflict teetering on the edge of explosion. "What are you waiting for?" the manager hissed, his voice sharp and venomous. "Get her out. Do I have to do everything myself?" The pregnant woman flinched at his outburst, her hand tightening over her belly as she instinctively leaned away from the man's aggression. The outspoken woman, however, didn't budge. She stepped in front of the pregnant woman, her body forming a barrier of protection. "She's not going anywhere," the outspoken woman said firmly, her voice ringing with conviction. "You've already humiliated her enough. This stops now." "Oh, it stops when I say it stops," the manager shot back, jabbing a finger toward her. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Standing there, pretending you're some kind of hero? Newsflash. This is my store, and you don't get to tell me how to do my job." The crowd erupted again, their voices a chaotic mix of anger and disbelief. "Your store," someone yelled from the back. "You're just a manager. You don't own anything. You're embarrassing yourself," another voice shouted. "Just apologize and let her go." The manager's head snapped toward the crowd, his face a mask of fury. "Shut up," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "All of you, shut up. You don't know what it's like to deal with people like this every single day. You think you're better than me? You think you can come in here and judge me? You're doing a pretty good job of judging yourself," the outspoken woman said, her words slicing through the noise like a razor. "Every word you say just makes it clearer who you really are." "And who am I, huh?" the manager sneered, stepping closer to her. "Go on, tell me. What kind of person am I?" "You're a bully," she said simply. "A small, insecure man who uses his position to tear others down because it makes you feel powerful. But let me tell you something. Real power isn't about control. It's about compassion. And you don't have any." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unison as they rallied behind the outspoken woman. The manager's face flushed a deep crimson, his fists clenching at his sides as he tried to regain control. "You think this is funny?" he snarled, his voice shaking with anger. "You think you can come in here and make me look like the bad guy? You don't need any help with that," someone quipped from the crowd, and the laughter that followed only fueled the manager's rage. "That's it," he bellowed, slamming his fist on the counter so hard that the items on it rattled. "I've had enough of this circus. Security, call the cops. Get every last one of these people out of my store." The security guard hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio as he looked to the crowd for guidance. The pregnant woman let out a soft gasp, her hand clutching the edge of the counter as her knees wobbled. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "I just want to go home." But the manager wasn't listening. His anger had consumed him, blinding him to everything but his own need to assert dominance. "Call them now," he barked at the guard. "I want this place cleared out." The outspoken woman stepped forward again, her voice rising above the noise. "You're gonna call the cops on a pregnant woman? For what? Trying to return a defective item? Do you even hear yourself right now? She's trespassing," the manager shot back, his voice frantic. "I told her to leave, and she refused." "That's trespassing." "That's not trespassing," a man in the crowd said, his voice calm but firm. "That's discrimination. And we're all witnesses." The manager's face twitched, his composure cracking under the weight of the crowd's growing defiance. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice faltering. "I'm just doing my job." "No, you're not," the outspoken woman said, her voice steady and unyielding. "Your job is to serve your customers with respect and dignity, and right now you're failing spectacularly." The crowd cheered again, their applause ringing through the store as the manager took a step back, his confidence eroding with every passing second. His gaze darted around the room, searching for an ally, but all he found were angry faces and raised phones, their cameras capturing his every move. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his fists clenching at his sides. "You people think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." The outspoken woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity that seemed to unnerve him. "You're right," she said softly. "We have no idea who you are, but after tonight, the world will." The manager's eyes widened slightly at her words, a flicker of fear crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Big talk," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But talk is cheap. Let's see how far it gets you." The tension in the room was suffocating now, the air thick with anticipation as the confrontation teetered on the edge of chaos. The manager, desperate to regain control, turned back to the security guard. "Well," he demanded, "are you going to do your job? Or are you useless too?" The guard hesitated, his hand still hovering over his radio. He glanced at the crowd, then at the pregnant woman, and finally at the outspoken woman who stood defiantly in front of him. "I think you're out of line, sir," the guard said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "Maybe you should take a step back." The manager froze, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the guard in disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I said," the guard repeated, louder this time, "you're out of line." The room fell into a stunned silence as the security guard's words echoed in the air. "You're out of line, sir," he had said, his voice calm but resolute. The manager's face turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw clenching so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. "What did you just say to me?" the manager growled, his tone low and dangerous. "I said you're out of line," the guard repeated, squaring his shoulders. The growing murmurs of agreement from the crowd bolstered his resolve. "You're escalating a situation that didn't need to go this far. This woman hasn't done anything wrong, and you're treating her like a criminal." The manager took a threatening step closer to the guard, his fists clenched and trembling. "You listen to me," he hissed. "I'm the manager of this store. I'm your boss, and when I tell you to do something, you do it. Do you understand me?" The guard didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deliberate step back and folded his arms across his chest. "With all due respect, sir," he said evenly, "I don't think calling the cops on a pregnant woman for asking for a refund is part of my job description." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out the manager's sputtering response. He whirled around to face them, his rage bubbling over. "Shut up," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "All of you, just shut up. You don't know what it's like to deal with people like this every day." "What do you mean, people like this?" a man in the crowd demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "You're the one acting like a maniac." "Yeah," another voice chimed in. "You're the problem, not her." The manager looked like he was on the verge of losing it entirely. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an ally, but the crowd was united against him now. Even the employees who had gathered nearby looked uncomfortable, their gazes a mix of embarrassment and disapproval. And then, just as the tension seemed ready to snap, the outspoken woman stepped forward again. This time, her calm, commanding voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "That's enough," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "This has gone far enough." The crowd quieted slightly, their attention shifting back to her. Even the manager froze for a moment, thrown off by the sudden shift in tone. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to do my job? You're nobody." The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Nobody," she repeated, her voice soft. "You're sure about that?" The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat as the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a phone. She tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward the manager. A video began playing, one that many in the crowd immediately recognized. It was a clip of the woman herself, standing on a stage, addressing a massive audience. The familiar cadence of her voice, the unmistakable presence she exuded. It hit the manager like a freight train. The crowd gasped, a ripple of recognition spreading through them like wildfire. Whispers of "Wait, is that?" and "Oh my God, it's her." filled the room as people scrambled to get a closer look. The manager's face drained of color as the realization dawned on him. His eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You're Oprah Winfrey, she said simply, her voice steady and calm. And you, sir, are in a lot of trouble. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising to a deafening roar as they processed the revelation. Phones were raised higher, the flashes of cameras illuminating the stunned expression on the manager's face. Oprah turned back to the pregnant woman, her expression softening as she placed a gentle hand on the younger woman's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Oprah asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. The pregnant woman nodded, though her eyes were wide with shock. I think so," she stammered. "Thank you." Oprah turned back to the manager, her expression hardening. "This woman came here for help," she said, her voice steady and measured. "And you treated her like a criminal. You insulted her, you humiliated her, and you tried to force her out of the store when all she wanted was what she was entitled to." "I didn't know," the manager began, but Oprah cut him off with a raised hand. "You didn't know?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "You didn't know how to treat someone with basic human decency? You didn't know how to do your job without letting your ego get in the way? Or is it that you didn't care?" The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd was silent now, their attention fixed on Oprah as she continued. "Leadership isn't about power," she said. "It's about responsibility. And right now, you're showing everyone here exactly why you shouldn't be in a position of power." The crowd erupted into applause again, their cheers echoing through the store. The manager looked like he wanted to melt into the floor, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Oprah's words. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "You're right," Oprah said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not over, because I'm going to make sure that corporate knows exactly what happened here tonight. And I'm going to make sure that this woman gets the apology and the respect that she deserves." The crowd cheered even louder, their voices rising in unison as Oprah turned back to the pregnant woman. "Let's get you taken care of," she said gently. "You've been through enough." "Oprah Winfrey," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. His gaze darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. The crowd had encircled him, their faces a mixture of disbelief, disgust, and righteous fury. "Yeah, that's her," someone whispered loudly from the back. "And she just exposed him for the bully he is. Serves him right," another voice chimed in. "What a pathetic excuse for a manager." The murmurs grew louder, fueled by the crowd's shared disdain for the manager. Several people began pulling up their phones, typing furiously as they uploaded videos and comments about the encounter to social media. Within moments, the manager's actions were going viral, his humiliation spreading far beyond the walls of the store. Oprah, meanwhile, remained composed and resolute. She turned to the security guard, who stood awkwardly to the side, clearly unsure of what to do. "What's your name?" she asked gently. Steve," the guard replied, his voice shaking slightly. "Steve Wilson." "Steve," Oprah said, her tone warm but firm. "Thank you for standing up and refusing to participate in this man's behavior. It takes courage to do the right thing, especially when you're under pressure. I want you to know I saw that, and I'm grateful for it." Steve blinked, visibly taken aback by her words. I was just doing what I thought was right," he stammered. "And you did," Oprah said with a small smile. "We need more people like you." The crowd clapped for Steve, their applause a stark contrast to the stony silence that greeted the manager. Steve looked down, clearly embarrassed but grateful, as Oprah turned her attention back to the man behind the counter. "As for you," she said, her voice sharp once more, "you owe this woman an apology." The manager's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "An apology?" he repeated, his voice rising. "For what? Doing my job?" The crowd groaned collectively, their disapproval palpable. "You call that doing your job?" someone yelled. "You treated her like garbage. You humiliated her," another voice added. "And now the whole world is going to see it," someone near the front muttered, holding up their phone as they recorded the manager's every move. The manager's face turned a deep shade of red. "I don't have to listen to this," he shouted, slamming his hands on the counter. "You people don't understand what it's like to deal with this every day. Entitled customers, freeloaders, liars. It never ends. Stop making excuses," Oprah said, cutting through his rant like a knife. "This isn't about anyone else. It's about how you treated this woman. You didn't see her as a person, you saw her as a problem. And that says a lot more about you than it does about her." The manager glared at her, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "You don't know what it's like," he spat. "You walk in here with your cameras and your fame, acting like you're better than me, but you don't know what it's like to work in the real world." "I know what it's like to treat people with respect," Oprah replied calmly. "And I know that's something everyone can do, no matter where they work or how hard their job is." The crowd erupted into applause again, their cheers growing louder with every word Oprah spoke. The manager shrank back, his confidence eroding further with each passing second. "And as for the cameras," Oprah continued, gesturing to the phones recording the scene, "you brought this on yourself. No one told you to yell. No one told you to escalate. That was your choice. And now you're facing the consequences. You can't do this to me," the manager hissed, his voice shaking. "I'll lose my job." "That's not up to me," Oprah said. "But if I were your boss, I'd be asking some serious questions about whether you're fit to manage this store." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their voices rising in unison as they rallied behind Oprah's words. The manager looked like he was about to explode, his face twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see a middle-aged man in a crisp suit stepping into the scene. His neatly combed hair and polished shoes marked him as someone important, someone who didn't belong in the chaos of the store's customer service counter. The manager's face lit up with a mixture of relief and hope. "Mr. Thompson," he exclaimed, his voice suddenly deferential. "Thank God you're here." The man, presumably a regional or district manager, glanced around the room, taking in the scene with a critical eye. His gaze lingered on the pregnant woman, who still stood trembling near the counter, and then shifted to Oprah, whose calm, authoritative presence seemed to dominate the room. "Care to explain what's going on?" Mr. Thompson asked, his tone cold and professional. The manager gestured wildly to the crowd and Oprah. "These people are making a scene," he said quickly. "This woman," he pointed to the pregnant customer, "was refusing to leave after I told her she couldn't get a refund. And then this lady decided to get involved and escalate everything." Mr. Thompson's sharp eyes narrowed as he turned to Oprah. "And you are Oprah Winfrey," she said simply, her voice steady. The man's reaction was subtle but telling. His eyes widened slightly, and his posture stiffened as recognition dawned on him. "Oprah Winfrey," he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I see. And you should see what your manager has done," Oprah said, her tone measured but firm. "He verbally attacked this woman, insulted her, and tried to have her thrown out for simply requesting a fair refund. This isn't just bad customer service. It's abuse," the manager sputtered in protest, but Mr. Thompson silenced him with a raised hand. "I'll handle this," he said curtly. The manager shrank back, his confidence evaporating completely. The crowd watched in silence, their collective judgment heavy in the air. The store fell into a hushed silence as Mr. Thompson turned his sharp gaze to the manager, who was now visibly sweating. The crowd watched, their phones still raised, documenting every second of the unfolding drama. Even Oprah stood quietly for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle before speaking. "Is what she's saying true?" Mr. Thompson asked, his tone sharp enough to make the manager flinch. "Did you refuse service to this woman, insult her, and try to have her thrown out?" The manager hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I was just following store policy," he muttered, his voice weak and defensive. "She didn't have the right—" "Stop," Mr. Thompson interrupted, his voice cold and final. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth." The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd's murmurs began to grow louder again, their collective disdain pressing down on him like a physical weight. Finally, he let out a frustrated sigh and threw up his hands. "Fine," he snapped. "Yes, I told her she couldn't get a refund, but I didn't do anything wrong. She was being unreasonable, and I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Oprah interjected, her voice calm but cutting, "is to serve your customers with respect. And from what everyone here has seen, you failed spectacularly at that." Mr. Thompson held up a hand to stop her, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Winfrey," he said, addressing her directly, "I assure you, this is not how our stores operate. This man's behavior is unacceptable, and I will deal with it immediately." He turned back to the manager, his gaze hard. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation. And based on what I've seen and heard today, I wouldn't count on keeping your job." The manager's face went pale. "You can't be serious," he stammered. "You're taking her side over mine? Over some random customer?" "I'm taking the side of decency," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "And you've made it abundantly clear that you don't belong in this position." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the store as the manager stood there, frozen in disbelief. His face twisted with a mixture of anger and humiliation, but he didn't dare argue further. With a final glare at Oprah and the pregnant woman, he turned and stormed off, disappearing into the back of the store. As the door swung shut behind him, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a palpable sense of relief. Mr. Thompson turned back to Oprah, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Winfrey, I can't apologize enough for what you and this customer have been subjected to," he said. "This is not how we operate, and I assure you, we'll be making immediate changes to ensure something like this never happens again." "It's not me you need to apologize to," Oprah said, gesturing toward the pregnant woman. "She's the one who was humiliated and mistreated." Mr. Thompson nodded, turning to the woman with a contrite expression. "Ma'am, on behalf of this company, I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced today. Your refund will be processed immediately, and if there's anything else we can do to make this right, please let me know." The woman, who had been quietly wiping away tears, managed a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just wanted to be treated fairly, and you deserve to be," Oprah said gently, placing a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. "No one should have to go through what you did today." As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached the woman to offer their support. One man handed her a tissue, while another offered to help carry her items to her car. The sense of community in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the hostility that had filled it just moments earlier. Oprah turned to Mr. Thompson, her expression serious. "I appreciate that you're taking steps to address this situation," she said. "But this isn't just about one bad manager. It's about creating a culture where respect and dignity are the norm, not the exception." "You're absolutely right," Mr. Thompson said, nodding earnestly. "I'll be reporting this incident to corporate, and we'll be reviewing all our training and policies to make sure this kind of behavior is rooted out at every level." "Good," Oprah said, "because the world is watching, and people deserve better." With that, she turned back to the pregnant woman, who was now smiling faintly as she accepted the help of the bystanders around her. "Are you okay to get home?" Oprah asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I think so," the woman said, her voice still shaky but grateful. "Thank you for everything." Oprah smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" the woman asked. "Never let anyone make you feel small," Oprah said. "You're stronger than you think." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. As she walked toward the exit, supported by the kindness of strangers, Oprah turned back to the crowd, her presence commanding as ever. "This is what happens when people stand together," she said, addressing the group. "When we refuse to let injustice go unchecked. Let this be a reminder that our voices matter, and that we all have the power to make a difference." The crowd erupted into cheers one final time, their applause ringing out like a victory bell. Oprah stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before quietly making her way toward the exit. As she stepped outside, the evening air cool against her skin, she glanced back at the store, where people were still buzzing with the energy of what had just unfolded. A small smile played on her lips as she thought about the ripple effect this moment might have. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a refund. It was about justice, about humanity, and about the power of one voice to spark change.